before the narrow pass of Thermopylae became a place of shields, dust, and memory, the story began far to the east, beneath the immense and tranquil skies of Persia. There, beyond the sun-baked plateaus and long mountain roads, beyond the orchards watered by hidden channels and the cities of carved stone, stood an empire so wide that its borders seemed to dissolve into distant horizons. It reached from the warm shores of Egypt to the valleys of India, from the high country of Anatolia to the old cities of Mesopotamia. Across this vast realm, rivers carried boats of grain, merchants led camel caravans through dry lands, and royal messengers travelled beneath the changing light of countless mornings. At the centre of this world was the king. Xerxes, son of Darius, ruled from palaces whose walls rose from the Persian earth in terraces of stone. His name, in the old Persian tongue, was Kshayasha. To Greek ears, it became Xerxes. He had inherited not only a throne, but a memory. A decade earlier, his father Darius had sent an army across the Aegean Sea to punish Athens and Eretria, cities that had supported a rebellion among the Greeks of Asia Minor. That expedition had ended at Marathon, where Persian soldiers had fought upon a broad coastal plain beneath the hills of Attica. The news of defeat had travelled eastward over sea and land, carried by ships, riders, and weary officials. It had entered the royal halls quietly, but it had not disappeared. Empires remembered such things. They remembered lost soldiers, broken plans, and distant cities that had refused to bow. When Darius died, the unfinished matter of Greece passed to Xerxes. Yet the young king did not set out at once. The Persian Empire was too great, and the sea beyond Anatolia was too uncertain for haste. Before an army could move west, there had to be order. Before ships could cross the straits, there had to be timber, rope, food, water, roads, and men who understood how to bring all these things together. So in the years after Xerxes took the throne, preparations began. They began in places no Greek writer would ever see. In grain fields where harvests were measured and gathered. In storehouses where sacks of barley and wheat were stacked in shadowed rooms. In workshops where bronze was warmed and worked, where leather was cut into straps, where bowstrings were twisted from sinew, flax, and cord. They began beside rivers where carpenters examined tall trees and considered the shape of ships not yet built. At Susa, one of the royal capitals, the mornings could arrive softly. The first light touched the walls of the palace and moved across glazed bricks coloured deep blue, pale green, and gold. Lions and winged bulls seemed to emerge from the cool shadows as dawn spread through the courtyards. Columns stood tall and still, their capitals carved in the forms of powerful animals. The air before sunrise held a brief gentleness, before heat rose from the stone floors and the dry earth beyond the city. Servants moved through the palace with quiet steps. Officials unrolled tablets. Scribes prepared ink and clay. Messengers waited with dust on their sandals from roads that had no end. In these halls, the empire became visible in numbers and lists. There were horses to be counted, mules for wagons, oxen for heavy loads. There were stores of grain, dried fruit, salted fish, wine, and water vessels. There were tents, tools, spare spear shafts, bundles of arrows, coils of rope, and the great quantities of wood needed for carts and ships. Each province had something to offer. From Egypt came ships and sailors familiar with broad waters and river currents. From Phoenician cities along the Levantine coast came expert seamen, shipbuilders, and navigators whose vessels had crossed the eastern Mediterranean for generations. From Cyprus came more ships. From Babylon came supplies, craftsmen and men shaped by the old rich lands between the Tigris and Euphrates. From Media came mounted warriors. From Persia itself came nobles and infantry, men whose families had long served the king. Other peoples came as well, from regions that seemed remote even to those who lived within the empire. Bactrians from the east, Succor from the open lands beyond, men from Cappadocia, Cilicia, Lydia, Thrace, and countless smaller places known by rivers, hills, and local gods. They did not all dress alike. Some wore soft caps or wrapped head coverings against the sun. Some carried wicker shields, light enough for movement across open ground. Some bore bows, their quivers full of arrows, with carefully shaped bronze or iron points. Others carried spears, axes, short swords, or daggers. Persian nobles and elite warriors wore finely made clothing, patterned fabrics, belts, and armor formed from layered materials. Their equipment reflected the wide world from which they came. The Persian army was not a single people moving as one. It was an empire in motion. In the cities of the interior, the passing of soldiers became a familiar sight. A traveler might wake before dawn and hear the soft ringing of harness buckles in the street. He might look from a rooftop and see lines of men moving between mud brick houses, their shadows long in the early light. He might smell smoke from cook fires, damp wool from tents, crushed grass beneath the feet of animals, and the sharp, dry scent of dust disturbed by many sandals. The movement was patient. It had to be. An army of this scale could not simply appear at the edge of the world. It flowed across the land like a broad, deliberate river. It paused to drink. It waited for supply wagons. It crossed bridges slowly. It rested near fields and streams. It sent scouts ahead and guards behind. The king's officials watched the roads, examined the food stores, and kept records as carefully as they could. The royal road, laid out under earlier Persian kings, helped make this possible. It stretched from the inland capitals toward Sardis in western Anatolia, crossing plains, valleys, rivers, and mountain passes. Along it stood stations where royal messengers could change horses. The fastest riders of the empire were said to travel through rain, darkness, cold, and heat, carrying the king's words onward without delay. Now those same routes bore the weight of something larger. Wagons creaked beneath loads of grain. Herds moved slowly beside the road. Pack animals lowered their heads and breathed warm clouds into the coolness of morning. Men marched in columns that seemed to continue beyond the next hill, and beyond the hill after that. Standards rose above them, marked with colors and symbols that caught the sunlight. The Western campaign was taking shape. For Xerxes, the route to Greece began with water. Between Asia and Europe lay the narrow strait the Greeks called the Hellespont. Today, it is known by another name, but in that distant age, it was already one of the most important waterways in the world. Its currents moved steadily between the Aegean Sea and the waters of the Black Sea. On one shore stood Asia, on the other stood Europe. To cross with a few ships was possible. To cross with the gathered strength of an empire was another matter. The Persian planners considered the problem with the practical patience of engineers. A fleet could transport men and animals, but ships alone would take time. Supplies would need constant movement. Weather could turn suddenly. The strait's current was strong, and the crossing would have to be protected. The answer was a bridge made from ships. Hundreds of vessels would be drawn together and anchored across the water. Their hulls would rest side by side, held in place by heavy cables and careful arrangement. Over them, planks and packed earth could create a road broad enough for soldiers, animals, and wagons. It was an immense undertaking, but Persia had resources no small kingdom could match. At Abydos, on the Asian shore, workers arrived in great numbers. They came with axes, adzes, hammers, ropes, baskets, timber, and the habits of men accustomed to difficult labor. Sailors guided ships into position. Carpenters measured boards. Engineers studied wind, tide, and current. The sea around them was never entirely silent. Waves moved against the shore in long, gentle patterns. Gulls turned above the water. At night, lamps flickered along the beach, reflected in broken lines upon the dark surface of the strait. The air smelled of pitch, salt, wet rope, and newly cut wood. The first bridge was built. Ships were anchored in rows. Thick cables were stretched from shore to shore. The structure rose across the water, a human-made line connecting two continents. For a time, it stood beneath the changing sky. Then the weather shifted. A storm came through the strait. The wind gathered strength. Waves lifted and struck the ships. Cables tightened and groaned. Wooden structures that had seemed firm in calm weather bent beneath the force of water and wind. The bridge broke apart. Ships were thrown out of alignment. Ropes snapped. Timber vanished into the grey, restless water. What had been planned over many months was undone in a short season of rough seas. Ancient stories say that Xerxes was furious with the Hellespont itself. Herodotus, who wrote of these events many years later, preserved the tale that the king ordered the water punished, as though the sea had disobeyed him. It is an image that has endured because it captures something strange and memorable. A ruler of vast lands confronting a force beyond any ruler's command. Yet after anger, whether real or embellished by later storytellers, came work. The Persians built again. This time, the arrangement was stronger. The ships were positioned with greater care. Cables of flax and papyrus were drawn tight. The work continued beneath the watch of officers and the slow observation of the king's court. Earth was spread over wooden planks. Fences were raised along the sides, perhaps to keep horses from looking down at the water and becoming afraid. When at last the crossing was ready, the empire began to pass over it. It did not happen in a single bright moment. Day after day, the procession moved. The first men stepped onto the planked surface and felt it shift almost imperceptibly beneath their feet. Ahead of them lay the European shore. Behind them stretched Asia, the direction of home. Around them, below the bridge, the water kept moving north and south with its old, steady purpose. Infantry crossed in ordered lines. Their sandals beat a muted rhythm on the packed earth. Horses were led carefully. Wagons rolled forward with soft groans from their wooden wheels. Camels and pack animals followed. Officers rode or walked beside their units. Priests carried sacred objects. Servants managed supplies. Scribes observed. Guards watched the flow. The bridge became a road over the sea. For those who crossed, it must have seemed impossible and ordinary at once. The task was enormous, but the daily experience was simple. One foot after another, a shield against the shoulder, a spear balanced in the hand, the salt wind touching the face. Above, the sky opened wide. The Aegean region had a light unlike the deeper colors of inland Persia. The sea reflected pale blue in the morning, then silver under the high sun. On clear days, hills could be seen beyond the water, softened by distance. The air was bright and dry. It carried the cries of seabirds and the slow murmur of waves against the shore. Xerxes crossed too, surrounded by the order and ceremony of kingship. He did not travel as an ordinary soldier. The king moved with guards, attendants, noblemen, and symbols of authority. Yet even a king, at the center of such a campaign, could see the same sea and feel the same wind. Before him lay Europe, a land of scattered cities, rocky coasts, olive groves, and people who had chosen not to submit. Once the army had crossed, it continued westward through Thrace. The land there changed from the dry plateaus of Persia and the older cities of Anatolia. There were green valleys, wooded slopes, rivers, and broad fields. In summer, the grasses turned pale beneath the sun. Dust gathered along roads where thousands of feet had passed. The air could be warm and heavy by afternoon, then cool quickly after sunset. The Persian columns moved through this landscape in measured stages. Villages watched them pass. Farmers paused in their work. Children stood at doorways or climbed low walls for a better view. Some communities had already submitted and offered earth and water, the traditional signs of obedience to the Persian king. Others waited quietly, uncertain what the great movement meant for them. The army did not always look like a weapon. At times, it looked like a traveling city. There were cooks tending pots over low fires. There were men repairing sandals and straps. There were animals grazing where they could. There were physicians, servants, interpreters, craftsmen, scouts, and merchants who followed opportunity wherever armies gathered. At evening, tents appeared across the plains. Fires glowed in thousands of small circles. Smoke drifted upward and thinned into the darkening sky. From a hill above one of these camps, a person might have seen no clear end to it. The tents stretched across the open ground. Horses stood tethered in rows. Spears leaned against wagons. Banners stirred gently in the night air. The sounds were softened by distance. A quiet murmur of voices, the small bell of an animal, the turning of wheels, the crackle of wood burning low. Beyond the camp, the stars appeared. They shone above Persian, Mede, Egyptian, Phoenician, and Thracian alike. They shone above men who had come willingly in service to the king, and men who had been called because the empire expected their presence. They shone above those who dreamed of reward, those who feared the unknown, and those who simply followed the road placed before them. The march continued toward the west. Along the coast, the Persian fleet moved in parallel where it could, carrying supplies and supporting the army. The sea was both pathway and danger. It promised speed, but it also held storms, reefs, and shifting winds. The commanders of the fleet knew its moods well. Phoenician sailors had spent their lives reading water and sky. Egyptian mariners understood the labor of oars and sails. Yet even the most experienced sailor could not command the weather. Before the army reached Greece, the fleet faced another great challenge near Mount Athos. Years earlier, a Persian expedition under Darius had suffered terrible losses when ships were caught in a storm around the long, rocky peninsula. Xerxes' planners did not forget. Instead of trusting the dangerous route around the exposed cape, they ordered a canal cut through the narrow neck of land behind it. Workers gathered there in enormous numbers. They dug into the earth with tools of wood and metal. They removed soil in baskets. They shaped the banks. The work went on beneath the sun, beside the sea, through days marked by the rhythm of effort. It was another sign of Persian power, another attempt to make geography serve the will of the king. When the canal was complete, ships could pass through calmer waters rather than risk the open cape. Slowly, patiently, the empire made its way forward. And far away, in the Greek world, reports began to arrive. They traveled through sailors, traders, fleeing travelers, and messengers who had seen the dust of the Persian columns. In marketplaces and council chambers, People spoke of the king's preparations. They spoke of ships, bridges, roads, and a host moving westward with the weight of many nations behind it. The Greek cities had spent generations competing with one another. They argued over borders. They quarreled over trade. They fought small wars against neighbors whose accents were only slightly different from their own. Athens was proud of its growing naval strength and restless democracy. Sparta was governed by old customs, kings, and a disciplined warrior society. Corinth looked outward to commerce and the sea. Thebes watched its own interests in central Greece. They were not united by habit. But the Persian advance asked them a question that could not be ignored. Would each city stand alone? Or would the divided Greek world find, for a brief and difficult time, a way to stand together? As Xerxes moved through Macedonia and toward Thessaly, that question became more urgent. The Persian army traveled beneath the heat of late summer. Dust rose from the roads in a thin, pale veil. It settled on cloaks, hair, shield straps, and the leaves of roadside trees. Water became precious at each halt. Streams were measured. Wells were watched. Food stores were carefully distributed. The strategic movement was slow because it had to be slow. A great army depended on what it could eat, what it could carry, and what it could find along the way. Commanders had to think not only of battle, but of roads wide enough for wagons, rivers shallow enough to cross, and fields capable of supporting animals. The Persian king's power was not only in soldiers and ships, it was in planning. It was in the ability to bring an empire's resources across enormous distances. Still, the farther west the army traveled, the more the land narrowed around it. Mountains rose, coastlines curved, roads became smaller. The familiar vastness of imperial territory gave way to the broken geography of Greece, where steep hills met narrow plains, and the sea was never far away. Somewhere ahead, beyond the northern approaches to central Greece, lay a pass known for its hot springs. There, mountains pressed close to the water. There, a small road ran between rock and sea. There, men from Sparta and other Greek cities would soon gather beneath the hard summer light, rebuilding an old wall and waiting for the sound of approaching footsteps. But for now, the pass was still quiet. Steam rose gently from the mineral springs. The sea breathed against the nearby shore. Small birds moved through the grasses. The cliffs held the warmth of the day and released it slowly into the cooling air. Far to the north, beyond hills and plains, the Persian army continued its patient march. Its fires glimmered at evening. Its banners moved in the wind. Its long shadows stretched westward. In the summer of 480,480,480 BCE, the Greek world waited beneath a bright and unsettled sky. The news had travelled ahead of the Persian king, as news always travels before an army. First in fragments, carried by fishermen arriving at familiar harbours. Then in murmured reports from merchants crossing the islands. Then in the breathless accounts of travellers who had seen the roads of Thrace and Macedonia, darkened by countless moving figures. Xerxes was coming. His ships had crossed the northern Aegean. His soldiers had passed from Asia into Europe over a bridge of vessels laid across the Hellespont. His campfires had appeared along the long coastlines of the north, and his banners had moved southward through valleys, over rivers, and between the low blue folds of distant hills. For the people of Greece, the approaching army was difficult to imagine in full. The Greek world was not a kingdom gathered beneath one crown. It was a scattered country of valleys, islands, and rugged shores. It was a patchwork of independent cities, each with its own laws, customs, rivalries, and memories. A man might call himself an Athenian before he called himself a Greek. Another might speak first of Sparta, Corinth, Thebes, Argos, or a small town surrounded by fields and olive trees. They shared language, shrines, stories of the gods, and the great festivals where athletes and poets came together beneath the sun. But they did not share one government, one army, or one clear sense of common purpose. For generations, the cities had watched one another with suspicion. Athens had built ships and expanded its influence across the sea. Sparta had guarded its old traditions in the southern Peloponnese, training its citizens for discipline and war. Corinth had grown rich from trade, standing near the narrow land bridge between northern and southern Greece. Thebes looked out across the plains of Boeotia. Smaller communities stood between larger powers, sometimes choosing allies, sometimes enduring the decisions made by others. There had been disputes over farmland. There had been arguments about borders, trade, colonies, and honor. There had been battles between Greeks and Greeks, fought under the same sun and with many of the same weapons. Now, however, a different presence moved closer. It came from beyond the sea, carried by the will of the Persian king and the immense resources of his empire. In cities throughout Greece, people gathered to listen. At a market in a coastal town, a sailor might stand beside baskets of figs and dried fish, speaking quietly of ships he had seen anchored near the Macedonian shore. In a mountain village, a traveller could arrive with dust around his sandals and tell of Persian columns moving along roads that had seemed too small to contain them. In the courtyards of temples, men spoke in low voices beside white stone altars, wondering which direction the army would take and where it might be stopped. No one could know every detail. Ancient reports grew larger as they passed from one person to the next. 100 ships became 1,000. A long column became a horizon without end. Yet beneath exaggeration and fear lay a simple truth. Xerxes had gathered a force beyond anything the Greek cities could easily meet in open country. The question was not whether the Persians were approaching. The question was how Greece might endure their arrival. Representatives from the Greek cities met at Corinth, where the land narrowed between two seas. Corinth was a place of movement. Ships arrived at its harbours from east and west. Carts carried goods across the narrow isthmus, rather than risk the long voyage around the Peloponnese. The smell of salt water mingled with the dust of roads and the smoke of household fires. There, in the presence of uncertainty, a number of Greek states agreed to cooperate. It was not a perfect union. Some cities remained neutral. Others submitted to Persia, offering earth and water, the traditional symbols of acceptance. Still others hesitated, waiting to see which side might prevail. Old resentments did not vanish merely because a distant king had crossed into Europe. But enough cities chose resistance to form an alliance. Their leaders considered the geography of Greece with grave attention. The north was open in many places. Broad valleys and passes offered routes southward. If the Persian army entered central Greece without delay, it could move toward Boeotia and Attica. Athens might be exposed. The roads toward the Peloponnese might be threatened. The alliance needed time to gather men, time to prepare ships, time to decide how such different cities could act together. The Greeks looked toward Thermopylae. It was a place shaped by stone, water, and confinement. The name meant the hot gates. There, near the northern entrance to central Greece, steep mountains descended toward the waters of the Malian Gulf. Mineral springs emerged from the ground, their warm vapor drifting into the air. The road that passed through the region was narrow. In places, it ran between the mountain slope and the sea, leaving only a restricted strip of ground for travelers, carts or soldiers. To an army moving from the north, Thermopylae was a doorway. To a smaller force willing to hold it, the pass offered a chance. The landscape of Thermopylae in that distant age did not look exactly as it does today. Over centuries, rivers carried soil and stones down from the mountains. The shoreline gradually moved outward. The sea that once came close beneath the cliffs lies farther away now. But in the summer of the Persian invasion, the waters of the Malian Gulf pressed much nearer to the road. The mountain rose dark and rough on one side. The sea moved on the other, its surface changing colour with the light. At dawn, it could appear grey-blue, soft beneath thin clouds. At midday, when the sun stood high, it flashed pale silver between the rocks. In the evening, it deepened into muted violet and bronze. Waves reached the shore in a patient rhythm. They folded against stones. They withdrew over wet sand and scattered shells. Their sound was never entirely absent. Even when men spoke, even when armor was lifted and walls were rebuilt, the water continued its quiet work below. The springs gave the place its name. Warm water flowed from beneath the earth, carrying the sharp mineral scent of sulfur. Steam rose in pale threads where heat met the cooler air. The springs had long been known to local people, who passed through the region with animals, goods, and stories. There was something ancient in that water, something that seemed to come from a deeper world hidden beneath the mountains. The Greek commanders understood the value of the pass. A large army could not easily use all its numbers in such a confined place. The breadth of the Persian host would be reduced to a narrow front. Soldiers would have to approach along a limited road, unable to spread wide across open ground. A disciplined line of heavily armed infantry might hold there far longer than it could on a plain. It was not a promise of victory. It was a calculation. It was an effort to use the shape of the land against an opponent whose strength lay in great numbers, mobility, and the reach of an empire. The defense of Thermopylae would be joined to another plan at sea. Near the island of Euboea, Greek ships would gather at a place called Artemisium. If the fleet could delay the Persian navy while the land force held the pass, the alliance might prevent the two Persian arms from moving freely together. The strategy depended on coordination, patience, and a willingness to remain in difficult positions. It also depended on men arriving in time. Among the cities that answered the call was Sparta. Far to the south, in the valley of the Eurotas River, Sparta lay between the high slopes of Mount Taygetus and the gentler eastern hills. Its people lived within a society unlike any other in Greece. Sparta had no grand circuit of city walls like those of some other places. Its strength, as Spartans liked to say, rested in its citizens and their shields. The Spartan way of life was ordered by custom, restraint, and obligation. Its male citizens trained from youth for endurance and discipline. They learned to march in formation, to bear discomfort without complaint, and to place the needs of the city above personal ease. Their world was supported by the labor of the helots, an unfree population whose difficult condition made Spartan society possible. Behind the calm surface of Sparta's military reputation stood a system marked by control, fear, and old tensions. Yet in the Greek imagination, and in the eyes of many allies, Sparta carried the authority of a leading military power. When the request for defense came, Sparta faced a complication of its own. The season of the Persian advance overlapped with sacred observances. The festival of Carnea was underway, a religious occasion important to the Spartans. Their customs restricted major military action during this period. Another sacred celebration, the Olympic festival, also shaped the rhythms of the Greek calendar. To later generations, this could seem strange. An army approached, and religious law still mattered. But to the people living then, the gods and the city were not separate things. Ritual was not a minor interruption to public life. It was part of the order by which public life continued. To neglect sacred duty could invite dangers as real, in their minds, as any army marching from the north. Sparta did not send its entire strength at once. Instead, it sent an advance force under one of its kings. Leonidas, son of Anaxandridas, belonged to the Argead royal house of Sparta. Like the other Spartan king, he held a position shaped by ancestry, law, religion, and military responsibility. He was not the first son expected to inherit. His path to the throne had opened through the deaths and circumstances of those before him. By the time he marched north, he was no inexperienced youth. He was a mature man, perhaps in his late 40s or early 50s, accustomed to the responsibilities of Spartan rule. He had a wife, Gorgo, who was herself remembered in later tradition as perceptive and direct. He had a young son. He knew the obligations that came with his name, and he knew that the journey to Thermopylae might not lead back to the valley of the Eurotas. The force that left Sparta included 300 Spartan citizens. They were not 300 strangers selected at random. Ancient accounts suggest that they were chosen men, each with a living son to carry on his household. The decision carried a quiet recognition of danger. Sparta was sending soldiers, but it was also preserving the continuation of their families should the road north prove final. The number would later become famous. Yet the 300 were not alone. This was never only a Spartan defense. Men came from many Greek communities, Tagans and Mantineans from the Peloponnese, Corinthians, Phliasians, Mycenaeans, Arcadians, Locrians, Phocians, Thespians, Thebans, and others. The exact numbers offered by ancient sources vary, and the total changed as the campaign developed. But several thousand Greek defenders gathered at Thermopylae before the Persian army arrived. They came by different roads. Some followed stony paths through the Peloponnese, passing groves of olive and cypress. Others travelled from central Greece, across fields of dry grass and vineyards heavy with late summer leaves. They walked beside mules carrying supplies. They crossed streams where the water ran clear over pale stones. They slept beneath cloaks or within small temporary camps, listening to insects singing in the darkness. The Spartan contingent travelled with a distinct measured character. The men wore red cloaks, though the exact appearance of every garment belongs partly to the distance of time. Their equipment was heavy compared with that of many soldiers in the Persian ranks. Each hoplite carried a large round shield of wood, faced or reinforced with bronze. It covered much of the body when held in formation. Its curved shape caught the sunlight along the rim and cast a shadow across the legs. They wore bronze helmets, shaped to protect the head, cheeks, and neck. Some helmets had crests of horsehair that moved softly in the wind. They carried long spears, their shafts smooth from use and carefully maintained. At their sides hung short swords, intended for the closeness of battle if a spear broke or could no longer be used. Bronze was not bright in the way polished gold is bright. It held light more quietly. Under morning sun, a helmet might glow dull amber. In shadow, it turned brown-green, almost the color of old leaves after rain. The metal smelled faintly of oil, sweat, and dust, Leather straps crossed beneath the chin. Linen or wool garments rested beneath armor. Sandals pressed into dry roads, leaving temporary marks that vanished beneath the steps of the men behind. The march north was neither hurried nor careless. An army moving toward a defensive position had to arrive with its strength intact. Men needed water. Equipment needed repair. Scouts had to move ahead, learning the condition of roads and asking local people what they knew. At each halt, soldiers set down shields and unfastened straps. They ate bread, olives, cheese, dried meat, or whatever provisions were available. They washed dust from their faces where streams allowed. At night, the soldiers slept beneath the stars. The Greek summer sky was wide and clear. The Milky Way crossed it in a faint band of white. Beyond the low sounds of camp life, there might be the call of an owl, the soft shifting of animals, or wind moving through a stand of trees. Some men would have spoken of home. Others may have remained silent, saving their thoughts for themselves. Above all, there was the knowledge that the Persian army was moving closer. As Leonidas and the allies approached Thermopylae, the land began to narrow. The road curved beneath the mountains. The slopes rose in layered shades of grey, brown, and green. Sparse pines held to the higher ground. Thorny shrubs clung to cracks in the rock. In places, the heat rested heavily in the pass, trapped between mountain and sea. In other moments, a breeze came off the gulf and moved through the cloaks of the marching men. The defenders reached the hot gates and looked upon the ground they would hold. There were several constricted sections of the route, places where natural geography made passage difficult. Near one of these narrow points stood the remains of an old wall, perhaps built by earlier inhabitants to mark or defend the passage. Time and weather had reduced it. Stones had fallen. Earth had settled over its base. Grass and weeds grew between the broken sections. Leonidas chose the place as the center of the defense. The work began without ceremony. Men carried stones from nearby ground. They lifted them with tired hands and placed them into rough lines. Others cut or gathered timber. Earth was packed between gaps. The wall did not need to become a perfect monument. It needed to slow an approaching enemy, to narrow the road, to give the defenders a fixed point from which their formation could operate. The sounds of labor were small and steady. Stone touched stone. Wood scraped against rock. Sandals shifted in dry soil. Someone called for another beam. Someone else brought water in a clay vessel. Shields leaned against the wall or rested beneath sparse shade while their owners worked. Above them, the mountains remained still. Below, the sea continued to roll against the coast. The Greek force arranged itself according to the needs of the place. Different contingents would take positions. The Spartans, renowned for their close order fighting, formed a central and important part of the defense. Other allies stood beside them. Their shields, when raised together, would make a continuous surface. Their spears would project outward in a line intended to meet an advancing force before it could reach the men behind. This method of fighting required trust. Each hoplite depended on the shield of the man beside him. The broad, round shield protected not only its owner's left side, but part of the right side of his neighbor. A gap could become danger. A man who moved too far forward could disturb the balance. A line held because individuals accepted their place within it. At Thermopylae, the narrow terrain made this shared discipline especially valuable. The Persian army might be enormous, but only a limited number of men could advance through the constriction at one time. The defenders would not need to face the whole empire at once. They would face its front edge, the first ranks moving toward the wall, the first shields, the first spears, the first men attempting to find room on a road between mountain and sea. This was the hope of the Greeks. It was also their burden. The defenders knew that the pass was not completely secure. There were paths in the mountains. Local knowledge mattered. A road that appeared impassable to a stranger might be familiar to a shepherd, hunter, woodcutter, or traveller who had spent years among the slopes. The Greeks placed Phocian troops near one mountain route, a path later known as the Thermopylae Trail. It climbed through the hills and offered a way around the main pass. The route was difficult, but not impossible. Its existence meant that Thermopylae could not be treated as an unbreakable wall. Still, for the moment, the main road was theirs. Days passed in preparation and waiting. The defenders watched the northern approaches. Scouts came and went. Local residents carried news from nearby settlements. The weather moved through its familiar pattern. Pale morning, hard midday brightness, long afternoon light, and evenings in which the mountain shadows stretched toward the water. The men maintained their equipment. They checked spearheads, tightened shield straps, and rubbed oil into leather. They arranged food supplies. They found places to sleep as best they could. Some rested beneath awnings or beside the wall. Others lay with cloaks around them, using folded garments as pillows. The ground was uneven and warm from the day's sun. There was time for quiet observation. A soldier might watch steam rise from the springs and drift away. He might notice a lizard disappearing beneath a stone. He might look toward the sea and see a fishing boat far from shore, its sail a small, pale shape against the water. He might think of the road that had brought him here, of a household left behind, of a mother, wife, child, brother, or friend. The coming battle was present in every thought, but it had not yet arrived. The quiet before it was not empty. It was filled with ordinary details made sharper by uncertainty. The taste of water after a long day, the weight of a helmet when lifted, the warmth remaining in a stone after sunset, the distant scent of smoke from a village fire. Leonidas moved among the men. There is little certainty about every word he spoke or every gesture he made. The ancient world preserved great sayings, but it did not preserve the full texture of a commander's ordinary hours. Perhaps he conferred with allied leaders beside the rebuilt wall. Perhaps he listened to reports from scouts. Perhaps he stood at times facing north, measuring the road with the eye of a man who understood that ground itself could be an ally or an enemy. He was king, but at Thermopylae, he was also a soldier among soldiers. His bronze armor would have carried the same dust. His cloak would have moved in the same sea breeze. His sandals would have pressed against the same rough earth. Around him, the Spartan officers and allied commanders considered the position, the supplies, the expected direction of the enemy, and the difficult balance between holding firm and remaining ready to adapt. Far beyond the pass, the Persian advance continued. Its approach could be sensed before it was seen. The first signs were subtle. More travelers arrived from the north. Local people spoke of emptying villages, of roads filled with animals and wagons, of the earth trembling faintly beneath many feet. The air seemed to carry more dust than before. A haze lingered over distant hills in the afternoon light. Then, one day, shapes appeared on the far road. At first, they were too small to distinguish clearly. A few mounted figures moved through the shimmer of heat. They paused. They continued. Behind them came other forms, slowly emerging from the pale distance. Scouts, perhaps, or the advance elements of a column that stretched far beyond the horizon. The Greek defenders watched from behind their wall. No horn needed to sound loudly. No man needed to shout. the sight itself was enough. Shields were lifted from the ground. Helmets were placed carefully over hair dampened by heat. Chin straps were tied. Spears were taken in hand. Men stood beside the companions with whom they would hold the line, their bronze equipment catching the last clear light of day. The Persian scouts observed the narrow pass, the wall, and the small body of men waiting behind it. Beyond those scouts, hidden still by distance and the folds of the land, came the great host of Xerxes. The mountains held their silence. The hot springs breathed their pale vapor into the evening air, and beneath the steady whisper of the Aegean waters, Thermopylae waited. The Persian army arrived at Thermopylae beneath the clear, unyielding light of late summer. For days, perhaps longer, its forward elements had been visible on the northern roads. Mounted scouts moving through the heat, supply wagons trailing pale dust, small groups of soldiers appearing and vanishing among the folds of the distant land. But now the larger body of the army reached the plain before the pass, and the landscape seemed to acquire an entirely new scale. The ground north of the hot gates filled gradually. First came the men who marked out the camp. They walked the dry earth with purposeful patience, measuring spaces, choosing places for tents, animals, supply carts, officers and guards. Then came the baggage trains, their wheels making shallow grooves in the dust. Pack animals lowered their heads beneath loads of grain, water skins, leather bundles, spare weapons, and household objects carried across half the known world. After them came the soldiers. They arrived in formations that reflected the vastness of the Persian Empire. Men from many provinces carried the signs of their distant homes in their clothing, weapons, and manner of march. Some wore soft felt caps. Some had wrapped cloth round their heads to soften the sun. Some carried bows, their wooden curves polished by use, with quivers resting against their backs. Others bore spears, short swords, wicker shields, or small axes. The colours of the camp gathered slowly across the plain. There were muted reds and deep blues in the fabric of cloaks. There was the pale brown of linen, the darker tones of leather, the dull glimmer of bronze fittings, and the white dust that settled over everything. Standards rose above the moving columns, catching the warm wind from the Gulf. Horses stood beside their handlers. Camels shifted their weight and blinked in the brightness. Mules, patient and tired, waited beneath their harnesses. The air was filled not with one single sound, but with many softened sounds layered together. Leather straps creaked. Wooden wheels turned slowly. Animals breathed and stamped. Pots were placed over small fires. Water was poured from jars. A distant voice called in a language unfamiliar to the people of Greece, then faded into the larger murmur of the camp. From behind the rebuilt wall at Thermopylae, the Greek defenders could see the Persian presence spreading before them. The road that had seemed quiet and narrow only days before was now the edge of a temporary city. Tents appeared across the open ground. Fires sent narrow lines of smoke into the evening air. The mountain slopes, which had stood unchanged through so many summers, now looked down upon an army gathered beneath their shadow. The Greeks were few by comparison. Their camp stood close to the constricted passage, where the road narrowed between the mountains and the waters of the Malian Gulf. Behind them lay central Greece. Before them stood the army of Xerxes. Yet the defenders had not chosen this ground because it was beautiful, though it possessed a stern and quiet beauty of its own. They had chosen it because the land imposed limits. At Thermopylae, the mountains did not rise gently. their slopes pressed downward in broken ridges of grey stone and sparse vegetation. Thorn bushes grew from cracks in the rock. Pines held their dark needles against the sky. In places, the mountains seemed to lean toward the sea, leaving only a thin passage between cliff and shore. Below the road, the water of the gulf moved in a slow rhythm. The waves were modest that day. They came toward the narrow beach and withdrew again, leaving shining traces among the stones. The sea smelled of salt and wet earth. It offered a cool breeze at times, though the heat remained gathered in the pass, resting over the road and the old defensive wall. The Persian king established himself where he could observe the Greek position. Ancient writers describe Xerxes watching from a place above the plain, perhaps seated beneath a canopy or surrounded by attendants and guards. From there, he could see the pass, the wall, and the small line of men who had gathered to deny him entry into central Greece. The Greeks must have appeared remarkably few. They were not hidden in distant forests. They had not scattered into the hills. They stood in plain sight, close to their wall, with their shields resting nearby and their armor ready for use. The bronze of their helmets reflected the sun in subdued flashes. Their spears rose in ordered groups. Red cloaks, darker cloaks, plain wool garments, and the different equipment of allied contingents made a narrow band of color against the pale stone. To Xerxes, accustomed to the movement of immense armies and the submission of many lands, the sight may have seemed difficult to understand. Here was a small force waiting in a passage that could not possibly contain the full strength of Persia. Yet they did not withdraw. The king waited. This pause has become part of the memory of Thermopylae. For several days, according to Herodotus, Xerxes held his army back. He may have expected the Greeks to recognize the scale of the force before them and abandon their position. He may have allowed time for the camp to settle, for scouts to study the terrain, and for the naval situation nearby to become clearer. Whatever the precise reasons, the waiting settled over the pass. Morning followed morning. The sun appeared over the eastern hills and warmed the Persian tents. In the Greek camp, men woke from uneven sleep. They drank water, ate what food they had, and examined their equipment. A shield strap could loosen. A spear shaft could split. A bronze helmet could rub painfully against the skin beneath it. Before battle, the smallest practical task mattered. At midday, the heat became heavier. The white dust of the road seemed almost luminous. Insects moved among the grasses. Cicadas sang from the slopes, their steady sound rising and falling in the dry air. Steam lifted from the hot springs, pale and faint, carrying the mineral scent that had given the place its name. In the evenings, the light softened. The mountains became purple-grey. The waters of the gulf darkened. Campfires appeared across the Persian plain, each one small but together forming a scattered field of orange light. In the Greek position, fires were fewer. Men spoke quietly. Some cleaned their weapons. Some sat with their backs against the old wall. Some looked northward, toward the vast camp, and then southward, toward the country they had come to protect. The waiting required its own kind of endurance. For the Greeks, every hour confirmed the size of the army before them. More soldiers appeared. More animals were led into camp. More tents rose. The Persian host seemed to breathe and expand across the plain, though even it had limits, dependent as every army was on food, water, roads, and the work of innumerable hands. For the Persians, the narrow pass remained a problem to be considered. A great army was powerful in open country. It could spread across a broad field. It could use cavalry to move around an enemy's sides. archers could find room to shoot. Different contingents could be brought forward in sequence, but Thermopylae offered little space. Its rocky walls and nearby sea reduced the broad world of numbers to a single, restricted road. The Greeks had understood this. Their way of fighting was suited to close ground. The hoplite stood within a formation, not as an isolated warrior, but as part of a living wall. His large, round shield rested upon his left arm. Its wooden body, sometimes faced with a layer of bronze, had a weight that became familiar through long training. A leather grip lay within it, and a strap passed over the forearm. The shield protected the man carrying it, but it also sheltered the exposed side of the neighbor beside him. The line depended on mutual steadiness. Helmets covered the head and cheeks, narrowing the wearer's view while giving a sense of enclosed protection. The bronze held the day's heat and the night's coolness. Beneath it, men wore linen or wool, and some may have worn layers of protection around the chest. Their long spears extended forward, each one a simple length of wood tipped with metal, but together they formed a difficult barrier. A man in the line could feel the presence of those beside him. He could hear their breathing. He could sense the pressure of a shield edge against his own. He could smell oil, wool, leather, dust, and sweat. He could see only fragments of the wider world through the narrow opening of his helmet. A section of road, the legs of men ahead, the mountain beyond, perhaps the glitter of water at the edge of vision. At Thermopylae, this close order would matter more than individual strength. On one of the days of waiting, Persian messengers approached the Greek position. They came along the road beneath the watchful eyes of both armies. Their task was formal, but the message carried the full authority of the king. The Greeks were asked to surrender their weapons. The words passed across the narrow ground. Leonidas, the Spartan king, gave the answer remembered by later generations. "Come and take them." The phrase is short in Greek, molon lab. It has survived because it carries the compressed character ancient writers associated with Sparta. Restrained, direct, and without ornament. Whether every detail of the exchange was recorded exactly as it occurred cannot be known. Such sayings often become polished as they pass through memory. Yet the essential truth remains clear. The Greeks did not intend to lay down their arms. The sea continued to move below the pass. Wind touched the crests of helmets and stirred the cloth at the shoulders of men standing watch. The hot springs released their quiet steam. The distant Persian camp waited beneath the same sky. Then, after the days of pause, Xerxes gave the order for the first attacks. The Persian force chosen to advance included Medes and Scythians, men from regions long incorporated into the empire. They moved toward the pass with the discipline expected of soldiers serving the king. Their equipment differed from that of the Greek hoplites. Many carried lighter shields and weapons better suited to open movement, archery, and the broader patterns of Persian warfare. Yet there was no open plain before them now. There was only the narrowing road. As they approached, the dust rose under their feet. It hung low in the hot air, softening the edges of forms. The Greek defenders came forward from behind the wall and arranged themselves where the passage was most confined. Shields lifted, spears lowered, bronze helmets aligned in a dense, quiet row. The first contact did not transform the landscape into noise so much as pressure. Men moved into limited space. Shields met shields. Spears pressed outward and inward. Sandals slipped on loose stones and found their balance again. Commands were spoken close to the ear, passed down the line in brief phrases. The fighting was shaped by the narrowness of the road, where only so many men could stand abreast. The Persian soldiers advanced, but their numbers could not unfold as they might have on a wider field. Those behind pressed toward those before them. Those in front met the Greek shield wall. The defenders held their position, the broad curves of their shields forming a surface against which the advance slowed. Spears reached out from behind the shield rims. The men in the rear of the Greek formation added weight and steadiness to those at the front. The road became the most important weapon in the battle. It constrained the Persian attack. It kept cavalry from finding useful space. It reduced the room available for archers to operate freely. It brought the combat close, where the heavier Greek shield and long thrusting spear were especially effective. The Greeks did not remain frozen in one posture. Ancient accounts suggest that they used disciplined movements, sometimes giving ground in a controlled manner, and then turning back upon pursuers who had lost their order in the narrow passage. Such maneuvers required confidence. A retreat, even a brief one, could become dangerous if men panicked or separated. But a trained formation could bend without breaking. The Spartan reputation rested partly on this ability to remain composed when pressure increased. Their allies stood with them, sharing the strain of the defense. The story of Thermopylae would later center strongly on the 300 Spartans, but the pass was held by a coalition. Men from different cities fought along the same confined road. Their dialects may have varied. Their local customs may have differed. Yet in those hours, they depended upon the same wall of shields and the same narrow strip of ground. The Medes and Scythians withdrew and returned. The day lengthened. Sunlight moved along the mountain face, leaving certain sections of the pass in shadow while the road still shone. The water below remained visible in brief, shifting glimpses. Its steady movement was strangely separate from the human effort above it. The Persian commanders watched the attacks closely. They saw the difficulty. They saw men unable to use the full advantage of their numbers. They saw the Greek line remain intact despite repeated pressure. This was not the kind of resistance they had expected from a force so small. At some point, Xerxes sent forward troops known to the Greeks as the Immortals. They were an elite Persian unit, associated with the royal household and with a fixed strength of 10,000 men in Greek description. The name Immortals may have come from a misunderstanding or a poetic rendering of a Persian term, but the unit itself was real enough. A prestigious body of well-equipped soldiers, selected for service close to the king. Their appearance carried significance. They came with more elaborate arms and clothing than many others in the army. Their equipment included spears, bows, and shields. Their garments may have shown the richness of imperial service. Patterned fabric, carefully made belts, metal ornaments catching the light through dust and heat. They advanced toward the hot gates, but even elite soldiers could not widen the road. The mountains remained where they had always been. The sea remained close along the shore. The old wall, repaired by Greek hands, still narrowed the approach. The heavy hoplite formation still waited within the constriction. The Immortals pressed forward, and the Greeks met them. Again, the shape of the ground governed the encounter. The front ranks of the Persian unit entered the confined space, while those behind could not fully join them. The line of Greek shields absorbed the approach. Spears moved forward in measured thrusts. Men shifted, stepped, braced, and held close to one another. Bronze struck bronze in brief, hard contacts. Wooden spear shafts touched shields and armor. The sound was close and contained, not a vast roar, but a series of repeated impacts, breaths, footfalls, and low commands. Dust settled on hair, eyelashes, and the crests of helmets. It clung to damp skin. It gathered in the folds of cloth. The defenders had their own losses and fatigue. No line could stand for hours without strain. Arms grew tired beneath the weight of shields. Shoulders ached. Throats became dry in the heat. A man whose spear had broken needed another weapon or a new place in the formation. Those who had been at the front needed moments away from the pressure. The Greek contingents could rotate. Fresh men moved toward the line while those who had fought stepped back behind it. The movement had to be deliberate. There was little room for confusion. One group shifted aside, another took its place. Shields remained close. The unbroken form of the defense mattered more than any individual position. Behind the line, wounded men could be tended as best they could. Water was shared, straps were retied. A damaged helmet might be adjusted. A broken spear could be replaced if another was available. There were no grand comforts in the pass, only small acts of care performed amid dust and exhaustion. As the afternoon passed, the Persian attacks did not achieve their purpose. The defenders remained in command of the narrow road. Xerxes, according to the ancient account, watched with rising concern. He had sent capable men into the pass. He had sent an elite unit, yet the Greek force had not dispersed. The passage remained closed. At last, evening began to approach. The sun lowered behind the western land. Its light moved across the dust and turned it gold for a little while. Shadows lengthened beneath the tents of the Persian camp. The mountain slopes darkened. The water of the gulf became smooth and blue-grey beneath the changing sky. The fighting slowed and then ceased. Men returned to their camps. The Persian soldiers who had entered the pass walked back through the plain, carrying fatigue in their posture and dust upon their clothing. Some would have sought water first. Some sat near fires, while attendants or companions examined wounds. Some lay down beneath the open sky or inside tents, listening to the endless movements of camp life around them. In the Greek position, the defenders also rested. Shields were set down. Helmets were removed, leaving damp hair pressed flat against foreheads. Men washed dust from their hands and faces where water could be found. They ate in small groups. The food was plain, but after a day of heat and exertion, even a piece of bread or a mouthful of water carried comfort. The allies spoke quietly. They had held the pass for one day. That fact offered no certainty about the next. The Persian army remained before them, vast and supplied. The king's tents were still visible across the plain. More soldiers stood ready beyond the ones who had fought. The Greek commanders knew that a narrow pass was an advantage, not a guarantee. Yet the day had shown that the Persian advance could be delayed. It had shown that geography, preparation, and discipline could matter against numbers. It had shown that the men gathered at the hot gates were not merely waiting to be swept aside. Night came slowly. The stars appeared above the mountain ridge. The Persian campfires stretched across the plain like a distant constellation, scattered and trembling in the dark. The Greek fires were smaller, closer to the wall and the sea. Smoke rose, thinned, and disappeared into the night air. The waves continued beneath the pass. They met the shore with a soft, repeating breath. They withdrew over stones. They returned again. Somewhere in the darkness, a horse shifted in its tether. Somewhere else, a guard walked slowly along the edge of camp, spear in hand. Men slept when they could, wrapped in cloaks, their weapons close beside them. Above the sleeping armies, the mountains held their ancient silence. And beyond the road, beyond the sea, beyond the distant homes of those who waited at Thermopylae, the night moved onward with calm and measured steps. The second day at Thermopylae began beneath a pale and quiet sky. Before the sun had fully risen above the eastern hills, a faint light settled across the pass, softening the edges of stone and water. The air held a brief coolness, a momentary relief before the heat of the day would return. The mountains stood in layered shadow, their slopes dark against the growing brightness. Below them, the Malian Gulf lay calm, its surface reflecting the earliest colours of morning. In the Greek camp, men stirred from their rest. Some had slept deeply, their bodies overcome by the exhaustion of the previous day. Others had slept lightly, waking often to the small sounds of the night, the shifting of a companion, the distant movement of animals, the steady breath of the sea below. Now they rose, slowly at first, gathering themselves for another day in the narrow passage. They reached for their armor with familiar hands. Bronze helmets were lifted from the ground and placed upon the head, the metal still cool from the night air. Straps were tightened beneath the chin. Cloaks were drawn aside. Shields were raised and settled against the arm, their weight both reassuring and demanding. Spears were checked, the wood examined for cracks, the metal tip adjusted where necessary. There was no haste in their movements. Each action carried purpose, and each man understood the importance of readiness. The narrow ground would allow little room for error. The formation would depend on steadiness, on the quiet discipline that held one shield beside another. Across the plain, the Persian camp was already awake. Smoke rose from cooking fires in thin, pale lines. Men moved between tents, preparing for the day's efforts. Horses were watered. Commands were given in many languages, their tones blending into a low and constant murmur. The great host of Xerxes had rested, and now it would move again toward the narrow gate that had resisted it. As the sun rose higher, its light touched both armies equally. It illuminated the bronze of Greek helmets and shields, bringing out muted glints that shifted as men adjusted their stance. It reached the patterned garments and weapons of the Persian soldiers, revealing colors softened by dust. It warmed the earth beneath their feet and drew the scent of dry soil into the air. The second day of battle did not begin with sudden movement. It unfolded gradually, as though the land itself required time to awaken fully. The Greek defenders took their positions along the constricted road. They stood where the mountains pressed closest to the sea, where the passage narrowed and forced any approaching force into a confined front. Their line formed once more. Shields overlapped, spears angled forward. The men behind pressed gently into the ranks before them, adding weight and stability. The formation became a continuous presence, not a collection of individuals, but a single, steady barrier shaped by human bodies and the will to remain in place. The Persian forces approached in measured waves. They had seen the nature of the ground on the previous day. They understood that numbers alone could not be brought to bear all at once. Yet the empire possessed depth, and depth allowed for persistence. If one group withdrew, another could advance. If fatigue weakened one line, another could take its place. The first movements of the day were almost restrained. Dust rose softly beneath the feet of advancing soldiers. The sunlight filtered through it, giving the air a muted, golden quality. The sound of footsteps, of equipment shifting, of low commands, carried across the narrow distance between the two sides. Then the pressure began again. Persian troops entered the pass, advancing toward the Greek line. Their shields lifted, their weapons were ready. Behind them, more soldiers waited, their presence felt as a steady push forward, a constant urging that left little space for hesitation. The Greeks held. Their shields met the approach. The bronze rims pressed against one another, forming a curved surface that absorbed the forward motion. Spears moved in controlled thrusts, extending beyond the line, then returning to position. Each movement was small, deliberate, repeated countless times in the confined space. The narrowness of Thermopylae shaped every moment. There was no room for sweeping maneuvers, no wide flanking movements across open ground. The battle existed within a corridor of stone and sea. Men could see only a short distance ahead, their world reduced to the immediate presence of those before them and beside them. The sounds of combat were contained. There was the steady impact of shields meeting, the scrape of sandals against dry earth and scattered stones, the low voices of officers giving brief instructions, the exhale of breath as effort was repeated again and again. It was not a single overwhelming noise, but a continuous, layered rhythm of contact and resistance. The sun climbed higher. Heat gathered within the pass. It rested upon helmets, upon shoulders, upon the backs of men standing close together. Sweat formed beneath the armor, dampening cloth and leather. Dust clung to skin. The air felt thicker, as though the narrow space held the warmth and refused to release it. Yet the defenders maintained their order. They had learned from the previous day. They rotated their positions where possible, allowing those who had borne the greatest strain to step back briefly and recover. Fresh men moved forward to take their place, preserving the strength of the line. This rotation required precision. A gap, even for a moment, could invite danger, but practiced coordination allowed the movement to occur without breaking the formation. Shields shifted, bodies moved, and the line remained intact, its surface unbroken to the eye of those pressing against it. The Persian commanders adapted as well. They sent different units into the pass, seeking a change in momentum. They varied the pressure, sometimes pushing forward more forcefully, sometimes drawing back slightly before advancing again. The intention was not a single decisive surge, but a sustained effort that might wear down the defenders over time. The day stretched onward. The mountains above remained silent observers, their slopes, marked by sparse vegetation and exposed rock, seemed unchanged by the events below. The hot springs continued to release their pale vapor, drifting upward in thin, wavering lines. The sea, always present, continued its slow, measured movement along the shore. In this setting, time itself seemed to slow. The repetition of movement, the steady pressure of opposing forces, the unchanging rhythm of the waves, all combined to create a sense of continuity that extended beyond the immediate struggle. One moment followed another with little distinction, each shaped by the same narrow ground and the same enduring effort. By midday, both sides had felt the weight of the conflict. For the Persians, the difficulty remained clear. Their numbers could not fully express themselves within the pass. Each advance met the same barrier. Each effort was constrained by the same limitations of space. For the Greeks, endurance was the central challenge. They could hold the line, but holding required energy. It required attention, strength, and the ability to continue despite fatigue. The sun did not relent. The heat did not ease. The narrowness of the ground offered advantage, but it also intensified the strain of remaining in place. Still, the line held. There were moments when the pressure seemed to increase, when the forward movement of Persian troops pressed more strongly against the shields. There were moments when the Greeks stepped back a pace, then returned, re-establishing their position with careful control. Each such movement was part of the larger rhythm, not a break in it. As the afternoon approached, a subtle change began to take shape beyond the immediate front. While the main struggle continued in the pass, attention turned quietly toward the mountains. Thermopylae was not a single isolated road without alternatives. There were paths, less visible, less direct, that wound through the higher ground. Among these was a route known to local inhabitants, a trail that climbed into the hills and eventually descended behind the Greek position. This path was not obvious to those unfamiliar with the region. It passed through wooded areas where trees offered shade and concealment. The ground was uneven, marked by roots, stones, and narrow clearings. It was not a road for wagons or large formations, but it could be traveled by determined men who knew its course. A man named Ephialtes entered the story here. He was a local resident, familiar with the terrain of the region. For reasons that ancient sources describe in different ways, he revealed the existence of the mountain path to the Persian command. Whether motivated by expectation of reward or by other considerations, his knowledge became a turning point in the events at Thermopylae. The decision to use the path was made with care. It offered an opportunity to move around the Greek defense to reach the rear of the position that had proven so difficult to break from the front. But it also required a force capable of navigating the terrain, moving quietly, and maintaining cohesion in unfamiliar ground. As the day of fighting in the pass continued, preparations were made. When evening approached and the light began to soften, a selected Persian force set out toward the mountains. Their movement was not announced with fanfare. It unfolded beneath the growing shadows, guided by those who knew the way. They began to climb. The air in the hills was different from that of the pass. It was cooler, touched by the shade of trees and the elevation above the sea. The scent of pine and dry leaves replaced the heavier mixture of dust and heat below. The ground, though uneven, absorbed sound more gently, softened by layers of fallen needles and earth. The soldiers moved in a long, quiet line. Their equipment, though necessary, had to be carried with care. Shields were held close. Weapons were secured to avoid unnecessary noise. Communication passed in low voices or by gesture. The path required attention, each step placed deliberately among roots and stones. Below them, the battle at the pass continued into the late afternoon. The Greeks, unaware of the movement in the hills, remained focused on the front. They held their positions as they had throughout the day, maintaining the steady pattern of resistance that had defined their defense. The sun lowered further. Its light stretched across the landscape, touching the tops of helmets and the edges of shields with a warm, fading glow. Shadows lengthened across the road. The heat began to ease, though the memory of it remained in the warm stone and the tired bodies of the men. As evening settled, the fighting diminished. Both sides withdrew slightly, the day's efforts giving way to the necessity of rest. The Persian troops who had advanced returned to their camp. The Greek defenders stepped back from the line, lowering their shields and removing their helmets. The second day had ended much like the first. The pass remained in Greek hands. The Persian army, despite its size and persistence, had not broken through the narrow gate. The defenders had endured, using the land and their discipline to maintain their position. Yet something had changed, though it was not yet visible to those at the wall. In the mountains above, the Persian detachment continued its movement through the night. The path wound through trees and along ridges. At times it narrowed, forcing the line to slow. At other moments, it opened slightly, allowing a more steady pace. The stars appeared above the canopy, glimpsed through gaps in the branches. The air grew cooler as the night deepened. At a certain point along the path, the Persians encountered resistance. The Phocians, assigned by the Greek alliance to guard the mountain route, were positioned along this high ground. They had been placed there with the understanding that the path, though secondary, could not be left unguarded. The encounter was brief but decisive. Arrows moved through the trees. The Phocians, surprised by the presence of the advancing force, withdrew to higher ground. Their intention, according to ancient accounts, may have been to hold a defensible position above the path rather than risk being overwhelmed along it. The Persian force did not pursue them far. Its objective lay beyond. Continuing along the trail, the soldiers descended toward the rear of the Greek position. The movement remained steady, guided by the knowledge that time and coordination were essential. The success of the maneuver depended on reaching the pass without being detected too soon. Back below, the Greek camp settled into the rhythms of night. Fires were lit, food was shared, wounds were tended. The men spoke quietly, if at all. Some looked toward the Persian camp, where countless lights flickered across the plain. Others turned their gaze toward the dark outline of the mountains, unaware of the movement taking place within them. Leonidas and the allied commanders considered their situation. They had held the pass for 2 days. Their strategy had proven sound within its limits, yet they knew that their position could not endure indefinitely. Supplies were not endless. Reinforcements were uncertain. The Persian army remained vast and patient. The wind moved gently through the pass. It carried the scent of the sea and the faint mineral trace of the hot springs. It touched the surfaces of shields and the edges of cloaks. It moved through the quiet spaces between men resting on the ground. Night deepened. The stars brightened above the mountains. The fires burned lower. The sounds of the camp diminished, replaced by the softer tones of sleep and watchfulness. In the hills beyond sight, the path continued downward, and as the hours passed, the balance at Thermopylae began, slowly and quietly, to change. Dawn came gently to Thermopylae on the 3rd day. A thin light gathered along the edge of the mountains, soft and pale, as if the world itself were reluctant to disturb the stillness that remained. The air was cooler than it would be later, touched by the quiet breath of the sea. The Malian Gulf lay calm below the pass, its surface smooth and faintly silver beneath the early sky. In the Greek camp, men began to wake. Some rose slowly, as though the weight of the previous days lingered in their limbs. Others were already awake, seated in silence, looking toward the narrow road or the dark shapes of the hills. There was a difference in the air that morning, a subtle shift that could be felt even before it was fully understood. During the night, news had arrived. Messengers had come with urgent words carried in low voices. The mountain path, the hidden route through the hills, had been used. Persian forces had moved along it under the cover of darkness. The defenders of that path had been overcome or displaced. The enemy was no longer only before the pass. It was behind them. The realization settled over the camp with quiet clarity. There was no sudden panic, no uncontrolled movement. The men who had come to Thermopylae had not expected ease. They had understood, even from the beginning, that the position was not invulnerable. Yet now the understanding became immediate and unavoidable. They were no longer holding a gate. They were standing within it. Leonidas received the reports and called the allied leaders together. They gathered near the wall that had been rebuilt only days before. The stones, still rough and uneven, held the memory of hurried labor. Around them, the land remained unchanged. Mountain rising on one side, sea moving steadily on the other, the narrow road stretching between. The discussion was brief. There was little time for extended debate. The situation was clear. The Persian army would soon press from both directions. To remain with the entire force would risk the destruction of all who had come to defend the pass. A decision was made. Much of the Greek army would withdraw. The allied contingents were permitted, and perhaps urged, to leave the position and move southward. Their survival would carry news of the battle. Their presence would strengthen the defences further within Greece. The stand at Thermopylae had already delayed the Persian advance. That delay now had to be preserved through those who could still continue the struggle. The departures began quietly. Men gathered their equipment, lifting shields, securing straps, taking up spears. There was no sense of disorder, only the subdued urgency of necessity. Groups formed along the road leading away from the pass. Some looked back toward the wall and the narrow ground where they had stood. Others kept their gaze forward, toward the path that would carry them away. Dust rose beneath their steps as they departed. The morning light grew stronger, illuminating the movement of those leaving and those remaining. The sound of sandals on dry earth, the soft clink of bronze and leather, and the murmur of voices accompanied the withdrawal. Not all chose to go. The 300 Spartans remained with their king. They were joined by a contingent of Thespians, men from a small city in Boeotia, who, according to ancient accounts, chose to stay of their own will. Their decision has echoed quietly through history, often overshadowed by the larger story, yet no less meaningful in its resolve. A group of Thebans also remained, though their presence is described differently in the sources, sometimes as compelled rather than voluntary. The precise nature of their role is uncertain, shaped by the perspectives of those who recorded the events later. What is certain is that the force at Thermopylae became smaller. The narrow pass, once held by several thousand men, was now defended by a few thousand at most, and perhaps fewer as the day unfolded. The scale of the confrontation shifted, not in its significance, but in its visible form. Leonidas stood among those who remained. He did not stand apart from them as a distant figure. He shared the same ground, the same air, the same narrowing circle of possibility. His armor bore the marks of the previous days. Dust rested along its edges. The bronze of his helmet reflected the morning light in subdued tones. Around him, the Spartans prepared themselves. They moved with a calm that seemed almost ritual in its steadiness. Cloaks were set aside. Shields were lifted and adjusted. Spears were tested in the hand, their weight familiar. There was no need for elaborate words. Each man understood the nature of the moment. They ate what food remained. It was a simple meal, taken not in haste but with quiet attention. Bread, perhaps, or other provisions carried from the south. Water was shared. These small acts, repeated countless times in ordinary days, took on a deeper presence in this setting, as though each movement held its own meaning. The Thespians stood among them. Their armor differed in detail, but their purpose aligned with that of the Spartans. They had chosen to remain in a place that would soon be surrounded. Their faces, like those of the others, were marked by dust, by sun, by the awareness of what lay ahead. The pass itself seemed unchanged. The mountains still rose in silence. The hot springs continued to release their pale vapor. The sea moved with the same steady rhythm, its waves touching the shore and retreating again. Nature did not alter its course for the decisions of men, yet the atmosphere had deepened. There was a stillness that carried weight, a sense that the space itself held the knowledge of what would come. The light, though bright, seemed softer, as if filtered through a veil of dust and distance. The Persian army prepared as well. From the north, the main force would advance once more into the pass. From the south, the detachment that had travelled through the mountains would descend, closing the path behind the defenders. The movement required coordination, but the advantage now lay with the larger force. As the sun rose higher, the final day began. The Greeks moved forward from the wall. Rather than waiting within the narrowest section, they advanced into a slightly wider area of the pass. This choice has been understood as an effort to engage the enemy more fully, to use the remaining strength of the defenders in a more active way. The formation took shape again. Shields overlapped, spears extended. The line formed not as a barrier alone, but as a presence moving into the space before it. The ground beneath their feet was dry and uneven, marked by the traces of the previous day's struggle. The Persians approached from the north. Their numbers, once constrained by the narrowest part of the pass, now found somewhat more room to gather. The advance was steady, guided by the knowledge that the defenders were no longer secure. The first contact came as it had before, with the meeting of shields and the measured movement of spears. Yet there was a difference. The Greek line pressed forward more actively. The confined ground still shaped the encounter, but the defenders were no longer solely holding a fixed position. They engaged the advancing force with a controlled intensity, their movements deliberate and sustained. The sound of the engagement remained contained. It was the steady rhythm of contact, of effort repeated again and again. The dust rose, softening the edges of figures. The sunlight, now higher in the sky, illuminated the scene with a clear, unwavering brightness. Spears broke. The long wooden shafts, effective in the earlier phases of the battle, could not endure indefinitely under repeated strain. When a spear splintered or lost its point, the man who carried it reached for another weapon. Swords were drawn. Short blades, suited for close fighting, replaced the longer reach of the spear. The nature of the engagement shifted slightly, becoming more immediate, more confined. Shields remained essential, their curved surfaces protecting and pressing forward. The defenders continued to move as one. Even as weapons changed, the formation held. The discipline that had sustained them through the previous days remained present. Each man's position was part of a larger whole, each movement connected to those beside him. The heat increased. The sun stood high, casting little shadow. The air within the pass grew heavy once more. Sweat gathered beneath armor. Dust clung to skin. The effort of movement became more demanding with each passing moment. From the rear, the Persian detachment descended. The path through the mountains had brought them behind the Greek position. Their arrival completed the encirclement. The defenders now faced pressure from both directions, the narrow ground offering no escape. News of this movement reached Leonidas and his men. The knowledge did not alter their course. They continued to hold and to press where they could. The focus remained on the immediate ground, on the men before them, on the formation that still gave shape to their resistance. At some point in the struggle, Leonidas fell. The exact moment is not recorded with precision. Ancient sources describe his death within the press of combat, surrounded by those who fought beside him. His body became a point of contention, as the Greeks sought to recover it, and the Persians sought to claim it. Around him, the fighting intensified. The Spartans and their allies moved to protect the fallen king, forming a tighter circle within the already confined space. Shields pressed closer. Swords rose and fell in controlled arcs. The dust thickened, carrying the scent of earth and metal. The effort to recover Leonidas's body succeeded. His companions drew him back from the immediate front, holding him within their diminishing line. The act was both practical and symbolic, an assertion of unity in the face of overwhelming numbers. The ground beneath their feet bore the marks of the struggle. Broken spear shafts lay scattered. Shields showed dents and scratches. The earth itself was disturbed, its surface no longer smooth but marked by countless steps, by shifting weight, by the passage of many men in a space too small to contain them easily. The defenders began to withdraw toward a small rise within the pass. It was not a hill in the sense of a distant landscape feature, but a slight elevation, a place where the ground lifted above its surroundings. There they could make a final stand, gathering what remained of their strength in a position that offered some measure of cohesion. They formed again upon this ground. The line was smaller now. The numbers had diminished through the course of the morning. Fatigue weighed heavily. Weapons were fewer, yet the formation persisted, its shape maintained by those who remained. The Persian forces surrounded them. From all sides, the presence of the larger army became complete. The narrow pass that had once limited the engagement now enclosed it. The defenders stood within a circle that grew tighter with each passing moment. Arrows were brought forward. In the earlier phases of the battle, the confined space had limited their effectiveness. Now, with the defenders gathered upon the rise and surrounded, the conditions changed. The archers raised their bows. The arrows moved through the air in great numbers, their flight creating a soft, continuous sound as they passed. The ancient story tells that the sky would be darkened by their number, and that the Spartans spoke of fighting in the shade. Whether spoken exactly as remembered or shaped by later retelling, the image endures as part of the memory of the moment. The arrows fell. They struck shields, armor, and the ground. They settled among the stones and the broken weapons. The defenders held their position as long as they could, their formation gradually yielding to the inevitability of the situation. The final moments were not marked by sudden silence. They were a continuation of what had come before, the same steady rhythm carried to its end. Movement slowed, the line thinned, the circle closed, and then gradually it ceased. The dust began to settle. The heat of the day remained, but the immediate motion of the struggle had ended. The small rise within the pass, once filled with movement, grew still. Around it, the Persian army stood. The road through Thermopylae lay open. The mountains remained as they had always been, their slopes unchanged by the passage of men. The hot springs continued to breathe their pale vapor into the air. The sea moved below, its waves touching the shore with the same quiet persistence. Where the defenders had stood, there was now only the trace of their presence. Shields lay upon the ground. Broken spears rested among the stones. The earth bore the marks of the final stand. Above, the sky stretched clear and wide, indifferent to the events that had unfolded beneath it. The hot gates had been held, and now they were still, after the last movement of shields and the final fall of dust at Thermopylae. A quiet settled over the pass. The narrow road, once filled with the steady rhythm of men standing shoulder to shoulder, lay open beneath the wide sky. The mountains still rose in their familiar silence, their slopes unchanged by the passage of armies. Below, the waters of the Malian Gulf continued their slow, measured motion, folding gently against the shore as they had long before the arrival of kings. The Persian army remained. Where the defenders had stood, now only the marks of their presence could be seen. Broken spear shafts rested among scattered stones. Shields lay where they had fallen, their curved surfaces dulled by dust and the weight of the day. The ground itself bore the imprint of struggle, uneven and disturbed, though already beginning to settle back into stillness. Xerxes had achieved what he required. The pass no longer stood between his army and the lands to the south. Thermopylae, which had delayed him, which had narrowed his vast strength into a confined path, had now been opened. The road into central Greece lay before him, winding through valleys and plains that had yet to feel the full presence of his army. Yet even in victory, the landscape did not change its nature. The hot springs continued to release their pale vapor into the air, their warmth rising from beneath the earth without regard for the events that had unfolded above. The sea remained constant, its sound soft and continuous. The wind moved along the pass, lifting small traces of dust and carrying them away. In the days that followed, the Persian army advanced southward. Its movement resumed the steady, deliberate pace that had brought it across continents. Columns of soldiers stretched along the roads, their forms extending beyond the visible horizon. Supply wagons followed, their wheels turning slowly over dry ground. Animals moved alongside them, their breath visible in the cooler hours of morning. The land beyond Thermopylae opened gradually. The narrow confines of the pass gave way to broader valleys and fields. Villages lay along the routes, some already abandoned, their inhabitants having departed ahead of the approaching army. Others remained, their people watching in silence as the Persian forces passed. In Boeotia, the plains spread wide beneath the sun. Fields of grain, now dry in the late summer heat, stood pale and still. Olive trees cast small shadows across the earth. The air carried the scent of dust and distant vegetation. Roads, once quiet, now bore the weight of thousands of feet and wheels. Athens lay further south. The city, known for its growing power and its restless energy, faced the reality of the advancing army with a decision shaped by both fear and foresight. Its people did not wait behind walls for a siege that might consume them. Instead, many chose to leave. They moved toward the sea. The harbors filled with activity. Ships were prepared. Families gathered what they could carry. The elderly, the young, and those unable to fight were taken aboard vessels that would carry them to safer places, to nearby islands, to the Peloponnese, to uncertain refuge. The city itself was left largely empty. Streets that had once echoed with voices and daily life grew quiet. Temples stood open to the sky. Houses remained, their doors closed or abandoned. The Acropolis, rising above the city, watched over a place that had chosen absence over surrender. When the Persian army reached Athens, it found a city without its people. Fires would later mark the presence of the invaders, and the memory of those flames would remain in the Greek imagination. Yet the decision to evacuate had preserved lives and allowed the struggle to continue in another form. Beyond the land, upon the sea, the story moved forward. While Thermopylae had been held and then lost, the Greek fleet gathered at narrow waters near the island of Salamis. There, the shape of the coastline created another kind of passage, not of rock and earth, but of channels and currents. The ships waited. Their hulls rested upon the water, rising and falling gently with the movement of the sea. Oars were drawn in, sails were furled. Crews remained aboard, their tasks defined by the rhythms of maritime life. The scent of salt, wood, and pitch filled the air. Among these ships were vessels from Athens, whose strength lay increasingly in its navy. The men who rowed them sat in ordered lines, their oars extending outward like the wings of great birds at rest. Their bodies would provide the motion that allowed the ships to turn, to advance, to retreat. Their effort like that of the hoplites at Thermopylae, depended on coordination, endurance, and shared purpose. The memory of the past travelled with them. Stories of the stand at Thermopylae moved from voice to voice, carried by those who had withdrawn, by those who had heard, by those who understood what the delay had meant. The narrow road between mountain and sea became more than a place. It became a measure of resistance, a moment in which a smaller force had faced a greater one and held it, if only for a time. The Persian advance, though successful, had not been without cost. Time had passed at Thermopylae. Days that might have been used to move deeper into Greece had been spent at the hot gates. The delay allowed the Greek alliance to gather strength elsewhere, to prepare for the encounters that would follow. At Salamis, the narrow waters would once again shape the course of events. The Persian fleet, vast and powerful, would find its movement constrained within the channels between island and mainland. The Greek ships, smaller in number, would use their knowledge of those waters to their advantage. The sea, like the pass at Thermopylae, would become a place where scale alone could not decide the outcome. The battle that followed would alter the course of the invasion. The Persian navy would suffer losses that limited its ability to support the army on land. The balance between the two sides would begin to shift, not suddenly, but with the slow turning of events that often defines history. Later still, at Plataea, the conflict would find another resolution. On open ground, where the constraints of Thermopylae did not apply, Greek forces would meet the Persian army once more. The result would bring an end to the invasion's immediate threat, though the larger relationship between Greece and Persia would continue to unfold in the years that followed. Yet even as these events moved forward, Thermopylae remained. The pass, quiet once more, became a place of memory. Those who had fallen there were not left without recognition. The Greeks, in time, marked the site. An epitaph, attributed to the poet Simonides, was said to stand upon the ground. Its words, simple and direct, addressed the traveller who might pass through the narrow gate. "Go, stranger, and tell the Spartans that we lie here, obedient to their laws." The inscription did not speak of victory. It spoke of duty. It spoke of the connection between the individual and the city, between the living and those who had given their lives in accordance with the customs they had accepted. It was a quiet statement, fitting for a place where the greatest significance lay not in triumph, but in endurance. The story of Thermopylae was shaped by those who told it. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, gathered accounts of the Persian wars and preserved them in his histories. His work combined observation, inquiry, and the retelling of stories that had already begun to take on the character of legend. Through him, and through others who followed, the events at the hot gates became known across the Greek world and beyond. Details were remembered, repeated, and sometimes reshaped. Numbers were debated. Speeches were recalled in forms that may have reflected later interpretation as much as original words. The figure of Leonidas grew in symbolic presence, representing not only a king, but an idea of steadfastness. Yet behind the shaping of narrative, the core remained. A narrow pass, a small force, a larger army, a delay that mattered. The contributions of the allied Greeks, too, remained part of the truth. The Thespians, who chose to stay, the Phocians who guarded the mountain path, the various contingents who stood in the line during the first days of the battle. Their presence formed the broader reality of the defense, even if later memory often focused on a single group. Over time, the landscape itself changed. Rivers carried sediment down from the mountains. The shoreline moved outward. The sea that had once pressed close to the road receded, leaving more land between water and stone. The exact shape of the pass shifted, though its essential character remained. Visitors in later centuries would see a place different from that known to Leonidas and Xerxes. Yet the memory of the narrowness endured. The idea of a gate, of a confined space where a few could stand against many, continued to define the meaning of Thermopylae. In quieter moments, long after the armies had gone, the pass returned to its older rhythms. Grass grew where men had once stood in formation. Small animals moved through the underbrush. Birds crossed the sky above the cliffs. The hot springs continued to steam, their warmth unchanged by the passage of time. Travelers passed through. Some came with knowledge of what had occurred there. Others may have known only that it was a place where the land narrowed between mountain and sea. The road remained a route between regions, a path shaped by geography rather than memory. Yet for those who paused, who listened, who allowed the stillness of the place to settle around them, there was a sense of something held within the landscape, not a visible presence, but a quiet weight. The mountains, ancient and unmoving, seemed to keep their own counsel. The sea, in its endless motion, offered no explanation. The springs, rising from the depths, carried their warmth into the air without revealing their source. And in that quiet, the story of Thermopylae remained. It was not only a story of conflict, it was a story of time, of movement across vast distances, of decisions made in moments that would echo far beyond them. It was a reminder that even the largest forces can be shaped by the smallest spaces, and that the course of events can turn upon a narrow strip of land between rock and water. As evening falls upon the pass, the light softens once more. The sky shifts from pale blue to deeper tones. Shadows lengthen along the slopes. The air cools. The sound of the sea becomes more distinct in the absence of other noise. The hot gates rest beneath this quiet. No armies stand there now. No shields form a line across the road. Only the land remains, holding within it the memory of what once passed between mountain and sea, and returning again and again to stillness.